Thank you. All right. So nice to see you all here today, and I appreciate you moving down. And I really appreciate if you have questions as we go along, so it isn't quite a static me conversation here. So interrupt me at any time. And what I wanted to talk about today, I really appreciate coming because it really gives me an opportunity to kind of synthesize some work that we've been doing over time and allows me to kind of reflect. And it's a great setting, you know, when you're able to pull together the parts of your research and try to weave a story. So that's what I'm going to try to do today, and end up with some, hopefully, threads of conversation that we can have in the graduate seminar after, and hopefully things will spark your attention, and this isn't all set, it's not all done, and we could certainly have a lot of conversations. And so I'm going to talk about wildfire, I'm going to talk about beetles, and how drought has affected those, particularly in the ecosystem that I'm most familiar with, and that's the pinyon juniper ecosystem of Colorado. I'd like to do 4 things today. Is this good? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, let me know. First of all, I want to talk about fire history. How did we develop the reference conditions for the areas that we're studying? And I'll focus a little on methods there. And then changes to those ecosystems that have occurred recently, mostly due to increasing size of fires, frequency of fires, and of course beetles that are affecting all over the West, and how that's changed the woodland structure. But then I'd like to end up with a kind of a positive and maybe somewhat speculative note where we would look at some of the possible ways that the ecosystem might be resilient to some of the changes that occurred. And I'll try to build that up. We're going to look at soil biogeochemistry studies that are going on right now, and also age-related climate sensitivity in the trees. So that's the plan. And I'll try to stick to the 1 hour. And again, ask me any questions as we go along. So first I want to introduce the ecosystem. Pinyon juniper woodlands are very widespread, and there are a lot of different kinds of woodlands, as you know. Many species are involved. What I'm going to be talking about is one part of the pinyon juniper ecosystem, and that's the persistent, what we started to call the persistent woodlands, to distinguish it from other pinyon juniper ecosystems. These are stands that get to a site and stay there. They persist there. They get very, very old. You can see very old junipers, very old pinyons, highly complex fuels in the area, high biodiversity. They're very, very rich ecosystems. And they've been there for a long time. So in particular, where I'll be focusing on today, one of the sites, Mesa Verde National Park, we've had pinyon juniper woodlands that look just like this for a long time. Again, you have very old trees, smaller trees, lots of infill, very high biodiversity. And as far back as we have photos, the place pretty much looked like that. So these persistent woodlands are different, perhaps, than other pinyon juniper woodlands. This is what they are not. Okay, so there are pinyon juniper woodlands that interface at ecotones with many different kinds of ecosystems, grasslands, the pinyon juniper savanna that might be driven much more by a frequent fire regime where when fires occur regularly, the conifers are killed. Grasses are maybe the more prevalent kind of vegetation. This is a very different kind of very important ecosystem with a much shorter fire cycle than I'll be talking about today. And also pinyon juniper shrublands that interface with even long-life perennial shrubs, very, very different kind of ecosystems. So I want to start this by being really clear that I'm not going to try to extrapolate these stories that we're weaving together to all pinyon juniper ecosystems. It's just not really legitimate to do that. And I want to build a case for why the persistent pinyon juniper, I believe, is such a wonderful model for us to look at today. So I'll be talking about 2 areas in Colorado Mesa Verde National Park in the southwest corner is home of many of these persistent woodlands. And then up in the northwest corner, Dinosaur National Park. I think you can see the confluence of the Yampa River and the Green River. This is a relatively unknown part of the persistent woodland that is just fantastic. This is what Dinosaur looks like. The Yampa River runs through. These old pinyon juniper woodlands develop on all sorts of different substrates, shales and sandstones. And the trees are just huge. I mean, this is not unusual to not be able to wrap your arms around these old pinions. And the disturbances are so infrequent that on some sites they are able to senesce to their natural capacity. We don't see this very much in pinions. We don't often see that they reach 800, 900 years old where physiologically they start to senesce. But this does happen frequently at Dinosaur. This is one of our favorite sites. My students dubbed it the Ridge of the Giants, where all the trees are very, very large, often split, and senescent trees have fallen in the area. So it's a very unusual look at pinyon juniper if you're used to the pinyon junipers, for example, around the Flagstaff area. Dinosaur is at the northern expanse of pinyon. So, of pinyon juniper today. So post-Holocene, it made its way up to this area. The Dutch John Mountains are the most northern site that is known. There's a little outlier in Colorado called Owl Canyon, north of Fort Collins. But for the most part, these are the north that pinyon ever went. And Gray has dated the Dutch John site for pinions to 1246. We have older pinions than that at Dinosaur, so they probably got there a little sooner. Today, these ancient gnarly pinions are reaching 1,100 years of age, and the junipers, which are much older, actually have been in this area for a longer period of time. So they've been there about 9,000 years. Pinions are perhaps the newcomer. So some of the trees that we're looking at Dinosaur may have been some of the original pinions that came into those sites. Okay, so I want to make a case for these persistent woodlands and why I think it's valuable to look at them. And one of the reasons is that these old trees have been able to withstand already a plethora of climate change. They established in a time period when climates were very different. They were able to persist through the medieval climate anomaly, through the Little Ice Age, and the stands actually date back to much further than many of the other pinyon juniper woodlands that we've been able to see. And I think that that's really important, and we're trying to figure out what it is about these stands that has made this possible. They have multiple age classes. There have been infills and mortality events in these stands, but they have persisted on the site. So I think that they're an important model, but that's something we could kick around later as well. Okay, so with that introduction to the persistent woodlands, I'd like to talk first about some work that we and others have done on the fire history. What are the reference conditions that allow for these old woodlands to develop and persist? If you look at this, just the structure of this woodland, it just seems logical that because the fuel is pretty consistent horizontally and vertically, that it would be very difficult to have a surface fire regime here. We also don't really have any fire scars. There's no evidence that there was a surface fire regime in many of these persistent woodlands. And so our expectation is that it has been a stand replacing fire regime as a natural phenomenon here. So it makes it difficult to date that. If it's a stand replacing fire regime, then how do you even figure out what the reference condition was? So what we have done, and many others have done as well, is date the oldest trees at a series of sites. So these are our study areas we recently finished at Dinosaur National Monument, where we dated the oldest pinions, the largest pinion cohorts, identified what that oldest cohort was, and used that date as the stand origin date at that point. Is that clear? Yeah. Remember, ask me any questions as we go along. So we did that all across dinosaur, and use that information to calculate the fire rotation. Now, this is the time it would take to reburn the entire study area. It's not the point location you're probably used to thinking about or fire return interval that you're used to thinking about in Ponderosa Pine, for example. This is a very different kind of measure because it's a landscape kind of fire cycle, right? So we would estimate from the minimum age of each of these stands. Junipers, the accompanying tree, as many of you know, don't cross-date well. They're very, very difficult to do dendro work on. We rely on the pinions that do cross-date fairly beautifully and can allow us to get a pretty good date of those sites. On the other hand, they're younger than the junipers for the most part. So these are kind of conservative estimates of the fire cycle. And so if you take the period that you're interested in, say the last 600 years, and look at the fraction of that analysis area that burned, either by using points or by extrapolating those points through various GIS methods to patches in the landscape, you could calculate an estimated fire rotation, which is the time it would take to reburn that entire study area. Does that calculation sit well with you? Okay. Very different from other kinds of estimates. So no matter if we use points or the extrapolation to areas, we converged at dinosaur on a pretty startlingly long fire cycle of 550 years. And that does have some interesting kind of, I hope we could talk about this after. Wow, that's a long time. It's actually not as long as others have recently found in different pinyon juniper woodlands where fire does not carry well. For example, the Colorado National Monument has upwards of 1,000-year fire cycles. But dinosaur is a weird place because it also has evidence of fire throughout the landscape. You have fire scarred, charred in young stands, as you might expect. So the pinion has been able to come back into an area that burned before. But you also have, you can't see this too well, burnt snags at the base of big old pinions. And there is even the very, very occasional single fire scar in the very old sites. And so we are in the process now, we just finished the fire history, and we are in the process now of going back and revisiting our sites and looking at down logs and looking at patches in that woodland and refining this fire cycle. So we've made kind of a first pass. We think that there's a very good evidence for a long fire cycle throughout the area, but we also think that the smaller patches very likely burned throughout dinosaur and created much more of a mosaic than in some other areas. And these are the patches that we're looking at. So we're outlining patches, sampling throughout those sites, and trying to find out what the fire cycle might be in these smaller, probably stand replacing patches throughout as well. So that's work that's ongoing and in progress. On the other hand, the probably better known fire history is of Mesa Verde National Park. And Mesa Verde National Park, we use the same kind of method, aging cohorts of pinyon and Gambel's oak, and we converge on a fire cycle a little shorter, 400 years. So it would take 400 years to reburn that entire mesa top, given the frequency of fire that we saw. In Mesa Verde, in contrast, there are no fire scars. There is no evidence of charcoal on the landscape. There are no snags, except in small known fires that we've mapped. So it's kind of a different ecosystem. And certainly in the 1900s, there was only one fire that we know And that's that period that Marlin and others have called the late 20th century fire deficit. It was really wet, and throughout the Southwest we didn't have a lot of fires. And there was a lot of infilling in these persistent woodlands of pinyon and juniper germinating. Right? So they're very, very thick stands. And I would maintain that's a very natural condition. But since 1996, and particularly since 2000, we've had a lot of fire in Mesa Verde. I'm sure that you've heard about these large fires. And if you look at our stand origin map, wow, the color is kind of different there. All the white outlined, which really should be green, light green, is old growth pinyon juniper woodland. Okay, so all this bottom part. All the little colorful patches are fires that we've been able to outline, either from historic data or from GIS or from dendro methods. And then the two big yellow blotches are one fire that burned in 2000. It's called the Bircher Fire. So the Bircher Fire and then this other one, the Pony Fire, burned almost at the same time in 2000 and really took out half of Mesa Verde National Park. So even if you could just look at the outlines that it's superimposed on, you could get a sense that this is a larger fire, and this then has been historically known in that area. Oh, yeah. So we have, I don't mean to say that because the fire cycles are so long that we don't have that fire doesn't play an important role in the area. There are some very, very interesting fire-adapted species. This is one, Nicotiana, the wild tobacco. Wild tobacco has a very tiny seed that gets into the soil and can persist for a long time. Some people say hundreds of years viability. And then smoke and red light and maybe heat causes it to germinate, gangbusters after fire. So it's very likely that the ancestral Puebloans would burn small sites and facilitate this plant over time. It's a very exciting plant. We also have perennial shrubs in the area that resprout immediately, sometimes within weeks after a stand replacing fire. Gamble's oak that you see here, serviceberry, many other species, Fenlera, will resprout and stabilize those soils right after the fire. And that's been really important for restoration in the Mesa Verde area because a lot of the landscape didn't have to have a lot of post-fire restoration because the soils were so stable. These things touch you. Okay. Here's another picture of that perennial resprouting of oak. And a cool little site. So we did have this one big fire in 1934. And I want to tell you a little bit about this fire because it's kind of interesting. It tells us a lot about post-fire recovery in this area. This is a fire that burnt through pinyon juniper and interior chaparral vegetation. And the CCC camps came in and planted over 10,000 trees after the fire. A few of those trees made it. Really just a few of those trees made it. But other than those few trees, there are no pinyons and junipers in that area. So this was in 1934. So in other words, it takes a long time for pinyon and juniper to return in the post-fire cycle. And that's partly what I want to talk about today. And that was in a fairly wet period, right, the 1900s. So we have some concerns about the pinyon juniper woodlands in general as the climates continue to dry and get warm. Okay, so starting about 1996, and again in 2000, 2002, 2003, 2005, we started to see these large wildfires, stand replacing wildfires. We believe that they are of the character of the fires that have always occurred in Mesa Verde, but certainly they are more extensive, as you saw on that map. And they pretty much take out everything. It's a kind of a moonscape, and then the perennials start to resprout. We have a very incredible collection of forbs come into the area, and then finally pinyon and juniper start to eke in maybe 30, 40 years after the fire. You'll see a few of them. Okay, so this was a reconstruction of the fires that we could do with living trees. But we're super lucky that Scott Anderson and Aaron Herring from NAU were willing to come into Mesa Verde and do paleoecology of the area. And they sunk 2 cores in an area called Prater Canyon. And Aaron has allowed me to show some of their findings because they reinforce what I'm talking about and extend it much further back. Very exciting work. So in brief, on the x-axis is the age in years before present, the medieval climate anomaly and the little ice age are shown there. And about here is when we started to have the current pinyon, juniper, chaparral type vegetation that we have today in this area. Off the screen here, fires were more frequent, as shown by charcoal. So this is mainly charcoal evidence that they used, but also pollen. Fires were more frequent, and then we get mostly sagebrush in that time. But when fires started to slow down to about 900 years between fire is when we started to be able to see the development of pinyon juniper woodland. So the pollen and the charcoal both show this. I think this is very, very cool because, look at this. So as we start to get into this dry period, we get charcoal, 2 different types of charcoal, increasing abruptly. And the red at the bottom is the ancestral Puebloan population. So you could see that those things track almost identically. As the populations grew, you've probably been to Mesa Verde and seen the ruins, and you should go to Mesa Verde. You'll love it. The populations were very high, and then abruptly, because of drought and other theories, they left right in here in about by 1300. And at that time, the charcoal also drops abruptly. The pinyon juniper woodlands start to build again, and then this is the time period that my group had been able to work with, right? And so that we went right into a very wet and cooler period where the pinyon juniper was able to build up to these beautiful persistent woodlands. And then we get to very recently, the time I'm talking about, 2000, the charcoal just goes ballistic again, right? So human influence is shown here in 2 very clear ways, I think. This period and this period. While humans are not living in Mesa Verde, it's not quite as proximal. It certainly is the ultimate effect that we have had on climate that is driving some of the more recent fire phenomena. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about post-disturbance. So we went in, Joint Fire Science Program funded us to go in and look at what are some of the effects of fires, and later I'll talk about beetles. But I want to talk just for a minute about methods, because I know all of you, your graduate students, you're probably thinking about, how do you do this? You know, we're not laboratory scientists. The landscape has to kind of speak to us. It's very difficult sometimes to try to put together a very solid experimental design. And we could do it in 2 ways. We could do side-by-side comparisons. We could look at a fire chronosequence like we have at Mesa Verde, and we could say, here's a 34 fire, here's a 59 fire, and try to equate as much as we can across that landscape. But that's tricky because you're assuming that the time since fire is the main thing, right? That everything else is equal. It's kind of difficult to do. And the other is a longitudinal study, where if you had actually been there before the fire and after the fire, you're able to do a study in the same point. And so the beauty of working in a place like, I have worked in Mesa Verde since 1989, so I was there before the fires. And that turns out to be a very helpful thing, that we can approach these things in two ways and see if you get the same answer, which is pretty awesome. Okay, so post-fire trends. First of all, remember this is the fire sequence. We had points all across that stand origin map, and we measured fuels. And you can see from these, I'm trying to show you really simple histograms today so we can kind of see some trends. As time since fire goes on towards the old growth, fuels kind of march on as well, right? Both the larger fuels, which are in black, 1,000-hour fuels, and then the 1 to 100-hour fuels. Also, as time goes on, fuels accumulate. Not too startling, right? But this is interesting. Okay, so we took those fuels and we put them in fire behavior models, and I'm sure you all know there are limitations to fire behavior models, particularly Nexus and Behave and those kind of static models. And we recognize and we acknowledge those limitations. However, they are also very, very useful if you're doing side-by-side analysis or relative analysis, because you can run the same analysis with the same constraints on both of these. And so what we see here is kind of interesting. This is by all measures, so spread rate, flame length. You get the greatest fire behavior in younger sites, and it drops off as time since fire, as the sites get older. There. Same thing with these measures, heat per unit area, and fire line intensity. So this kind of thing, which means that the greatest fire behavior that we're expecting is actually in the younger stands and not necessarily in the old growth stands. And I want to show you what that looks like so that you can kind of get a sense of why this might feel intuitively true. So here's stands that are less than 200 years. You've got a lot of shrubs in the understory, maybe a few trees coming in, and they're kind of hard to catch, but when they do, we have fairly low values. Wait, oh yeah, there. Then as they start to fill in and get older, we know this is an old fire because they're snags, so somewhere beyond the 200 years, but certainly under the 400-year range, the fuels start to accumulate, and this is when it starts to get very, very flammable. Here we have lots of vertical continuity in the fuels. If they start, they can really go, these are usually wind-driven fires. But when you get to those old stands, they've been there hundreds of years, trees start dying. There's lots of native beetles in the area. There's a black stain root disease that pops holes throughout this canopy, and they tend to open up. And you could see this. This isn't a particularly good picture of this, but you could see that there are these openings throughout the canopy, and that, in fact, these are very hard to burn. And all the fire intensity and all the other measures tend to drop. However, there's a relatively new player on the Mesa Verde scene at right about the year 2000. Cheatgrass came into this area, as it has throughout much of the Southwest. And cheatgrass is very flammable. It cures to be a very flammable continuous fuel, as you know. And if it were to start a fire, unfortunately it hasn't happened yet, but it would burn in a much flashier way and is not predicted by those models I just showed you. So we could have a very different kind of situation where we wouldn't even have pinyon juniper in that area. Okay, so to summarize, we have fuel steadily increasing, but we have this kind of blip in fire behavior where the in between the mid-successional stands are more flammable. The old growth gets harder to burn. And then finally, what I didn't, and I won't show you any data, but remember that it's a very slow recovery. It can really take centuries to build these woodlands. And that was kind of a startling thing for many of us to realize. Okay, so now I want to shift gears. Like, that was fire, right? That's been a big disturbance, but we've got a new disturbance that is climate-driven, and that is the proliferation of native beetles. So Ips, Confucius here killed many, many, many pinions throughout the West in 2002 to 2005. Other beetles, Dendroctonus, as you well know, are continuing to do this, but this is what this landscape looked like in 2002. Many, many, many dead trees. In Mesa Verde, all those old mesas we saw pictures of, the trees began to die. And we know that this is a time when we had drought conditions in the area, that throughout the Southwest we had soil moisture deficits, and essentially in all throughout the Southwest, there are places where 90% of the pinions died. There's lots of reasons for this drought activity, right? So we have a lot of research going on right now, very rich studies that are showing that there are things like reduction in resin ducts, xylem cavitation, problems with hydraulic lifting, all sorts of different factors which are making the trees very susceptible to beetles or just to drought. The junipers are dying without a beetle vector. And that happens very quickly. And so in Colorado, where our study area, this happened between 2002 and 2005, and you could see that the orange, the greatest death of pinion was in the Mesa Verde area. And the other thing to note is there isn't any in the dinosaur area. So far, so good in the dinosaur area. In Mesa Verde, the oldest trees, these are the pinions, about 35% of the pinions died, but heavy in the bigger classes, older classes. And in junipers, only 11%, although those are continuing to die. Okay, so what we're looking at, and the graduate students got the paper that we recently finished, or what are the structural changes to the woodland that we can attribute to the beetles, and how might that affect fire behavior? So much like we did with the fire chronology, we're now looking at the beetle effects. So again, I want to go back to the kinds of methodology that you would use. So you could look at side by side, and we did that. We had areas that had heavy beetle infestation, light beetle infestation, no beetle infestation. And we're on similar substrates. Or you can do longitudinal studies. And we had done a lot of studies in 1993 when we developed the fire history and did fuel loading in Mesa Verde. We were able to go back to those precise sites. Only 10 of them didn't burn in 2002, but luckily we had 10 left, so we were able to do historic comparisons. And then also Mesa Verde National Park had a wonderful biologist who had collected data from the 70s to about 1995, 1996. And so we were able to draw on her data for home production, for seedling establishment, and also way back, I collected a bunch of data on comb production when I was working on my dissertation in that area long ago. So it's really valuable to keep your data, because that really can give you some incredible insights. And I'm really glad that we had it. So here's where we went. We went all through Mesa Verde, greater Mesa Verde. This is Mesa Verde National Park. This is the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation. This is also old growth pinyon juniper, but with big openings of sagebrush. The green here is old growth pinyon juniper, and you can see our whole series of points that we put in. Some of them for the historic comparisons, some of them for the side-by-side comparisons. And at each point, we did transects, where we had a series of plots to look at age structure data, collected the cores of all the trees, additional plots to do floristic data, and belts to look at seedling and sapling establishments. Okay, so let's look at one of the historic comparisons here. So I mentioned that there were 10 sites that we were able to go back to. And not surprisingly, sorry, I'm going to learn to run this thing. Not surprisingly, the mean diameter of pinyon dropped significantly. The oldest trees died on those sites. So it kind of verified what we thought. But the junipers didn't. Juniper is still pretty well established there. And so there is some worry by managers, in particular, that this is converting to more of a juniper-dominated phenomenon and not pinyon juniper anymore. And that could be very likely. The other thing we did is kind of a novel approach. So we wanted to know structurally, not just what ages and sizes were there, but how are they distributed on the landscape? So what is the structural complexity of the woodland after beetles go through? And we adopted a method that was first done by Dordell in the lodgepole pine, where we used the Shannon-Wiener index, which you've probably often heard about, using it for species diversity. But we adopted this method looking at structural diversity. So how even are the age classes that are left with dead trees and without dead trees? And we calculated this in a couple of different ways. This is very busy. I apologize for that. And there was one line there that's white because it's an anomalous site. And since you can't see it, that's fine. It's really there. I wanted to own up to it. But anyway, we have three measures. The Shannon-Wiener index for diversity and the evenness index. If those numbers decrease, that suggests that the structural diversity also is reduced. The dominance index, Simpson's dominance index, is showing how many classes are accumulating the dominant tree. So if it increases, then structural diversity decreases. So if you just scan the numbers at these 5 locations, in all cases except the one that's blotted out, and we think we understand why that is, the structural diversity decreased once the trees fell. That isn't the case when the trees are still there, but 6 years after the event, actually it's a simpler forest. The structural diversity is lower. And that has implications for the biota, and that has implications for the understory, and we could talk lots more about that. Okay, so what is then, if we've got these changes in the complexity of the fuels, how might this affect fire behavior? Just like we did with the fire chronosequence, we wanted to look at that for the beetles. And you've probably talked about this a lot. Some people here do beautiful research in this area. Different systems are very different, I think, in their response to the beetles. So we know, for example, that in some areas they've hypothesized that as the beetles kill all the trees are standing there dead, that the area is much more flammable, and that fire intensity is expected to increase, fire frequency is expected to increase. But there's as many papers that say pretty much the opposite, that as you thin the forest, then your fire intensities might go down, maybe after the needles fall off of the trees. For example, lodgepole pine, Simard and others have shown this to be the case in some of those regions. And then there's the kind of in between, because if you take out big trees, you might be increasing the ladder fuels in the understory because of light intensity changes. So it could go a lot of different ways. It's a very interesting and dynamic question, I think, one that we are faced with now in the West. It has no very clear, specific answers dependent on the forest. And so we came at this from the angle that the beetle kill would take out parts of the forest. I showed you the cheatgrass in the area, that it would then facilitate cheatgrass coming into these sites, increase the flammability of the fuels, maybe even allow for surface fires that hadn't been there before, and also that coarse fuels might increase as well. So in our side-by-side comparison, we showed that low, medium, and no IP sites, certainly the high IP sites had more fuel, as one would expect, in both categories. But again, this did not translate into a change in fire behavior. I'm just showing you two of the graphs, but they're just flat. Low, medium, and high. Fire predictions were almost identical 6 years after the fire. So in one case, when we did a historic comparison, we had fuels in 1993. We went back to that same area. We did find an increase in heat per unit area in that comparison. So here the fire chronosequence, the IPS chronosequence and the historic gave us two different visions. And so the jury's really still out on this for May severity. And we could be looking at limitations to those models as well, so that there are some physics-based models that are using these data and they're trying to refine this as well. Okay. All right, I'd like to transition now to the last part of my talk for the last 10 minutes or so. So we think about these possible type conversions, going to juniper, maybe even going to shrubland. There's really a lot of concern that as we continue to have drying and raising temperatures in the west, are we going to just see a completely different kind of landscape? And this is very possible. But what I want to talk about is, what can the persistent woodland tell us about resiliency? Is there some level of resiliency that these stands will exhibit that we can learn something and help us predict what might happen in the future? And so this is where our work is very current and a tad speculative. So I want all you graduate students to think about this and question me after. And let's try to kick some of these ideas around, because it's kind of fun. So we have two different ideas about resiliency. Okay. One is that these old growth forests have very well-developed biotic crusts, which we know are nitrogen fixing, soil stabilizing, wonderful safe sites for pinyon germination, for example, right? We also know that there are no weeds in those old growth stands. And I mean that they can be cheatgrass right here. Here's the old growth stand, fire, no fire. They just do not go in there. Okay, so that's an important thing to remember. I'm also very fascinated by Persia tridentata. These pictures seem a little washed out, but this is Persia tridentata, an actinorhizal species in the understory. Also nitrogen fixing, super abundant, nodulated. We know a lot about Persia. It's the most prolific understory plant in these particular ecosystems. And it's actinorhizal. The nodules have frankia. Fixations dependent on soil moisture. I'm putting the names of my colleagues who have worked on this. And we are very, very interested in it as a stabilizing influence. We think that it has a lot to do with this persistent woodland. At least that's the hypothesis, right? So the other idea is, are these two things redundant? If crust is there, do you not need Persia? Are they synergistic? Are they providing the same kind of ecological function? So that's what we're trying to tease apart, because they're both really important parts of these woodlands. And the woodlands are clearly resilient in some ways because they are not succumbing to invasions and other problems that we see after fire. So we've set up a series of sites in May severity that are color-coded there. But basically, it's sites that have high Persia, low crust, high Persia, high crust, low Persia, high crust, and neither. So we have them in pairs, as close to each other as we can. And we've been looking at the soil biogeochemistry, and I'm just going to give you a few little highlights as we're coming to the end here. But it's very, very complicated, and we're still teasing it out, but a couple things are clear. One is that under the Persia, in any of these sites, phosphorus is depleted. So we had envisioned that these Persias were going to be like islands of fertility, right? They're nitrogen fixing. These are going to be wonderful little spots of fertile soil, much as you have in the deserts. There's really a big body of literature that suggests that this is true in the desert and many other arid ecosystems. But we found first that phosphorus was depleted under the Persia relative to other plants in the area. This makes a lot of sense for a nitrogen fixer, however, because nitrogen fixation itself is very enzyme-driven, uses a lot of phosphorus. So that was not terribly unusual. But if this is an island of fertility, we expected to see a big spike of nitrogen. In fact, if we look at our nitrogen in the inner spaces beneath non-fixers and beneath fixers in those 4 sites, so each panel is one of the different types of sites that I described, we don't see much difference at all. So nitrogen, it doesn't seem to be pooling up under the Persia. Kind of startling. And then if you look at carbon to nitrogen ratios, you start to see some other interesting trends. This is the interspace. Certainly the carbon-nitrogen ratio in the interspace between any shrubs is lower than all the shrubs considered together. But if you pull out the fixers from the non-fixers, you find there isn't really much difference between the carbon-nitrogen ratio in the interspace and under the fixers. And this did not sit well with us. We were going, what? What could be going on? We also had foliar measures, and this could be part of the reason why. The foliar carbon to nitrogen ratio in pinyon, in Persia is very low if you compare it to pinyon and juniper. And so it could be that the low carbon part of that is allowing for rapid decomposition of the needles, allowing nitrogen to pass through, even though they're definitely fixing nitrogen. And is everyone aware of what I'm talking about when I say fixing nitrogen? Great. So that they are increasing the total N nitrates, nitrites, no doubt. But it seems to be being pushed out into the soil much more readily than we thought at first. And so then the other question was that redundancy. And just very quickly, we had a hypothesis that where the crust and the Persia were going to be together, we wouldn't see a difference in fertility, that the crust would take the place of the Persia, that it would pool up under the Persia, and then the crust would fill in, and so that the whole ecosystem would be very rich in terms of its soil biogeochemistry. And so we actually didn't observe any difference across our sites, partly because, as I already told you, the Persia isn't pooling up nitrogen, but also the Persia seems to overwhelm the crust. So Persia, we concluded, and there's a lot more to this story, but I'm just hoping that this will tantalize you to start thinking about these actinorhizal species. But this pilot, which is done with Dr. Sasha Reed at the USGS as our soil biogeochemist, very, very smart lady. And she thinks that really it is all about Persia, that we have more evidence that Persia is fixing, that Persia is stabilizing the soil, and crust, while we love them, and we know they have humongous ecosystem functions, they aren't really providing the same kind of components that the Persia is. So it seems to be Persia, and we'll be continuing this, of course, next year. So that makes it a little bit of a worry because Persia is starting to die back. This year we started to see not only dead Persia, this is work done by a senior at Prescott College, her senior project, she documented death, particularly of the larger Persias, but also in the ones that don't die, a considerable dieback. So the photosynthetic material is not being produced, and this may be a way to get them through the drought, but we are not sure yet. So especially in the larger classes, larger plants, we're getting retrenchment. We're not sure what that is going to play into this area. Okay, and so finally, are these things, what's another component of resiliency? It's germination, right? We want to see pinions coming into the area despite the drought if they're resilient. And we are seeing pinions, particularly under nurse plants, as we'd expect. We are seeing them in canopy openings, and those canopy openings tend to have Persia. So Persia seems to be a very favored nurse plant for pinion. And we have historic data that suggests that the numbers of pinions today are far lower, seedlings and saplings, than Marilyn Collier was able to measure in the same sites from 1975 to 1995. So that was a really wet period, right? Pinions and junipers were both coming in. I'm just showing you the pinion. And it's time of infilling. It's a time when the forests thicken up in their natural way. And now we're seeing a different kind of phenomenon. We're seeing very, very low, but it's still happening, recruitment. So we think that they're still somewhat resilient. This kind of episodic establishment in pinyon juniper is really the norm. We measured this in many other places. This is in Dinosaur, back up north there, but again, we see in the 1900s at the edge here, we're seeing tremendous influx of trees into the understory, whereas in the mid-1700s, there's a hiatus of germination. We've seen this in southwestern Colorado with ponderosa pines as well. So episodic recruitment is maybe part of that resilient strategy, right? As long as the old trees can still persist. And finally, our last study, this is a master's thesis done by Dustin Hanna at the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research, U of A, and he was looking at how these old pinions in Dinosaur respond to climate, and if that is different across their ages. So do they have the same kind of sensitivity to climate throughout the ages? He collected logs, cores throughout Dinosaur, and he found, I'll show you a couple of things, that the measure called mean sensitivity, the mean sensitivity to the mean sensitivity across ages increases very abruptly. Trees are very, very sensitive as they age. They're increasingly sensitive till about 300 years, and then things kind of level off. So the older trees, and we're going out to about 850 or 900-year-old trees, is what he's been able to do it on so far. The older trees tend to be less sensitive. They get into the area, maybe whatever it is, and now we're trying to figure out what is it. And one thing it could be is sensitivity to precipitation. So if you look at trees from 100 years old, as he did to 800 years old, and you look at their mean sensitivity relative to PDSI, which PDSI is a measure of both drought and temperature, precipitation and temperature. You see a very clear decrease, R squared is 0.61, decrease in sensitivities of trees as they age. So the very oldest trees are least sensitive to the PDSI. Those ancient trees that are there, maybe they were sensitive when they were younger, but now they are able to withstand these perturbations. So that, in and of itself, could be part of resiliency as well. Okay, great. So just to summarize what I've tried to talk about today, persistent pinyon junipers and only persistent sites have these long fire cycles, but recent climates have started to change that fire cycle. We're starting to see larger fires, and we're not so sure how far they are out of the historic range of variability yet. In the last few years, we haven't had any fires, so we're kind of settling down. Beetle kill has reduced the old trees, has reduced the structural complexity, and we haven't seen a lot of effect of that on fire behavior. Resiliency, which is sort of the high point of what I'd like to reinforce today, could come from a lot of different ways in these forests. And the old forests could tell us a lot about that. It could be the capacity to keep recruiting, even though it's in a very small way, but to keep recruiting seedlings so that a few are still coming in. And episodic recruitment, you get a wet year, bring in a lot of seedlings. It's going to ebb and flow. That's what we like to call it, ebb and flow. And that nurse species are really critical to this resiliency in ways we aren't sure yet. And then finally, that age-related change in sensitivity may be part of the resistant pattern. This work was done by a whole bunch of different people. Sasha Reed here is one of our collaborators on all soil biogeochemistry. She's the soil lady. Carla Roybal, students, Prescott College students, have worked with Sasha on this. And this is our team in the field at Mesa Verde. Monique Roca in the top corner is our fire modeler. She's at CSU. Dave Hanna, our GIS person. Dustin Hanna, our dendro person. And Bill Rami here in the corner is all things fire. He knows about it all. So this is our team, and I just want to acknowledge that none of this work gets done by one person, and collaboration is definitely the way to go, in my opinion. And many, many, many Prescott College students have been involved here. Stephanie's work, I showed you, students in the field. So we feel like we have a very rich group, and it's wonderful to have students involved. And so again, thank you for having me. I'm really excited that the graduate students invited me. And I'd like to talk more about these things this afternoon.